Welcome back to the deep dive. We've got a massive, an incredibly complex web to untangle today.
We really do. It's a heavy one.
Yeah. And we're looking at a question that, might not seem obvious at first glance, but it is fundamentally reshaping the global south. We're asking, what Africa must learn from the Israel-US-Iran conflict?
Right.
To do this, we've pulled together a really dense stack of sources for you. We've got foundational UN documents, global economic data from the IMF and the World Bank.
Heavy-hitting security analyses, too.
Exactly. Stuff from the RAND Corporation and CSIS, plus African institutional frameworks, and even some high-level strategic theory from scholars like John Mearheimer and Henry Kissinger.
It's a fascinating stack. And the core premise we're exploring today is, well, it's vital to understand. Because while this specific conflict is geographically centered in the Middle East, its shockwaves, they don't stop at those borders.
No, they definitely don't.
Those shockwaves travel fast. They hit your wallet, they affect local fuel pumps, and they dictate the broader stability of global markets. Essentially, we're looking at a localized geopolitical earthquake that generates a global economic tsunami.
A global economic tsunami. I like that. And before we really get into the weeds here, I want to set some ground rules for you, the listener. Our mission today isn't to litigate the politics of the Middle East.
Right. There are plenty of shows for that.
Exactly. We aren't here to endorse any specific viewpoint regarding the highly charged Israel-US-Iran conflict. Our job is to look strictly at the geopolitical mechanics, the security analyses from places like RAND, and the economic data from the IMF to answer one question.
How does this conflict reshape Africa's strategic future?
Yes. So, okay, let's unpack this. We're taking a journey today, starting with global vulnerabilities and ending with African resilience. Let's start with the map.
The map is everything here.
It really is. Think of global shipping routes as the cardiovascular system of the global economy. The U.S. Energy Information Administration has this detailed data on what they call world oil transit choke points. And when you look at those numbers, you realize just how fragile this entire system really is.
The cardiovascular analogy works well, especially when we look at the specific arteries in danger right now. We're talking about the Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb, and the broader Red Sea.
Right.
The EIA data shows just how disproportionate the risk is. The Strait of Hormuz alone sees a massive percentage of the world's daily oil consumption flow through it. And it's an incredibly narrow stretch of water.
Right, but the cardiovascular analogy makes sense for the global economy, but aren't we overstating the risk a little bit here?
How do you mean?
Well, if a strait is threatened, a commercial ship can just reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, right? Down at the southern tip of Africa. It takes longer, sure, but the oil and the goods still flow.
They do still flow, yeah. But the cost of that detour is staggering.
Okay.
According to the World Bank data we pulled, sending a massive container ship or an oil tanker around the southern tip of Africa isn't just a minor inconvenience.
Yeah.
No, it adds roughly 10 to 14 days to a journey from Asia to Europe.
What?
That means burning millions of dollars in extra fuel per trip.
Wow. Millions.
Yeah. Add to that the massive spikes in maritime insurance premiums for vessels even going near the Red Sea or the Gulf of Aden right now. Insurers are pricing in the risk of drone strikes and piracy.
So they pass the buck.
Exactly. Those extra millions in fuel and insurance don't just vanish. They get passed straight down the supply chain to the consumer.
It's wild to think about. You go to the grocery store in Nairobi or Lagos, and the price of cooking oil or maize is up because a drone was intercepted over a strait thousands of miles away.
The disconnect between the local impact and the global cause is staggering.
It really is.
And that's exactly where the IMF's World Economic Outlook data comes into play. It maps out the exact mechanism of this inflation.
Break that down for us.
So many African emerging markets have a high degree of fuel import dependence. They buy oil on the global market, which is usually priced in US dollars.
Right.
So when a Middle Eastern choke point is threatened and global energy prices spike, African central banks suddenly have to burn through significantly more of their foreign exchange reserves just to keep the country's lights on and the supply trucks moving.
Which naturally devalues their local currency.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It drains dollar reserves, devalues the local currency, and triggers severe inflation vulnerability. And it doesn't stop at the gas pump.
It bleeds into everything else.
Higher transport and energy costs bleed directly into agricultural production. Fertilizers cost more to ship, tractors cost more to run, and getting the harvest to market becomes prohibitively expensive.
So an external geopolitical shock instantly becomes a domestic crisis in Africa?
Yes. showing up as a severe threat to food security.
So the map dictates the market. But it's not just about geography, it's about how modern conflicts are actually fought. And here's where it gets really interesting.
It does.
When we dig into the RAND Corporation's studies on proxy warfare, there's a clear shift. We aren't just looking at direct state-on-state conventional wars anymore.
Right, the era of massive marching armies is largely behind us in these theaters.
Exactly. RAND details how modern conflicts rely heavily on indirect engagement. And if you look historically, we saw similar dynamics during the Cold War.
Where global superpowers use the African continent as a chessboard.
Yes, to fight indirect conflicts. Now we're seeing those same indirect proxy dynamics playing out intensely in the modern Middle East.
The RAND research is crucial for understanding the mechanics of this. States use proxies, meaning funding local militias, sharing intelligence, providing advanced weaponry, because it allows them to exert influence and damage rivals while maintaining a level of plausible deniability.
Plausible deniability is the key word there.
Absolutely. It allows sponsors to test military capabilities and bleed their adversaries without putting their own uniformed troops on the front line, which keeps the conflict below the threshold of triggering a massive direct retaliation.
And this brings us right into the analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS. They look at modern deterrence.
A really fragile system.
So fragile. CSIS highlights the incredibly delicate logic of what they call escalation control. You have regional powers and global players like the U.S. competing indirectly, constantly testing boundaries.
Always pushing, but trying not to push too far.
Right. They're trying to deter each other without accidentally triggering an all-out regional war.
It's a highly calibrated, incredibly dangerous balancing act. And it's highly relevant for Africa because it shows that conflicts are no longer contained.
Because the whole point is indirect pressure.
Exactly. When escalation control is the strategy, the combatants intentionally look for asymmetric ways to pressure each other. Disrupting global trade through proxy attacks on shipping lanes is a perfect example of asymmetric pressure.
It hurts the adversary's economy without directly bombing their capital.
But as we just discussed, the collateral damage of that strategy falls heavily on emerging markets.
Which brings us to the rules of the road, or rather the lack of them.
The international law component.
Right. If you pull out the UN Charter, specifically Article 2, Paragraph 4, the rules seem perfectly clear. It strictly prohibits the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state.
It's the absolute foundational rule of international law regarding sovereignty.
But when you contrast that beautifully written document with the realities on the ground detailed in the RAND and CSIS reports, the disconnect is massive.
Yes, and analyzing the UN Security Council mandate provides a lot of clarity on why that disconnect exists.
How so?
Well, the Security Council is the body with the actual authority for international intervention and crisis management. But its structure means that any of the 5 permanent members can veto an action.
Right.
This practically guarantees institutional paralysis whenever the interests of major global powers clash, which is exactly what happens in the Israel-US-Iran dynamic.
Right, because if one permanent member backs a proxy and another backs the opposing state, any UN resolution demanding a ceasefire or enforcing Article 2.4 just gets vetoed.
Exactly. For Africa, observing this conflict reveals a very harsh truth about the modern international system. It exposes the stark limits of global institutions in diplomatic crisis management.
It's a sobering realization.
We have to note neutrally that for African nations, watching the UN struggle to enforce basic sovereignty and freedom of navigation in the Middle East is a powerful lesson. It signals that relying solely on international law and global institutions for sovereign protection is an incredibly risky bet right now.
So, if international law is effectively paralyzed by vetoes, what actually drives the decision-making of these big powers? Our source stack gets deeply theoretical here, pulling in some academic heavyweights to help us make sense of the underlying drivers.
Yes, Mearheimer and Kissinger.
Right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, what do these 2 scholars tell us?
These 2 scholars offer distinct lenses through which to view the raw strategic and geopolitical drivers of this conflict. Obviously, we're separating their analytical interpretations from the historical facts on the ground, but their theories help explain the why behind the actions.
Let's start with Mearheimer.
John Mearsheimer is famous for the theory of offensive realism. In Mearsheimer's framework, the international system is inherently anarchic. There's no global 911 to call, and as we just saw, the UN Security Council is often deadlocked.
So it's every state for itself.
Therefore, states are driven primarily by a harsh, survival-based logic.
Meaning they seek to maximize their own power and ensure their rivals can't dominate their region.
Precisely. Under Mearsheimer's offensive realism, the U.S., Iran, and Israel aren't just engaging in localized disputes. They're actively preventing each other from controlling critical energy flows and achieving regional hegemony.
And for Africa.
Applying this lens means they can't rely on moral arguments at the UN. They have to assume that major powers will weaponize trade routes and proxy forces if it serves their survival and power maximization goals.
Okay, and then you contrast that somewhat grim bare-knuckle view with Henry Kissinger's world order.
Kissinger focuses a lot more on navigating a multipolar balance.
So it's less about dominating everything.
Right. It's less about maximizing offensive power at all costs, and more about finding a strategic equilibrium where different powers can coexist without blowing up the entire system. It's about understanding the shifting weights on the geopolitical scale and adjusting accordingly through diplomacy and back channels.
And both of these theories seem to be playing out simultaneously.
They absolutely are.
We see the offensive realism in the proxy strikes, the arming of militant groups, and the militarization of choke points. But we also see the attempts at multipolar balancing of diplomatic back channels, the regional summits, and the careful calibration of escalation to avoid a world war.
Exactly. It's a constant push and pull.
But knowing the UN is paralyzed and that great powers are playing a high-stakes game of offensive realism, that doesn't really help an emerging market dealing with 15% food inflation.
No, it doesn't.
So if the global shield is broken, what does this all mean for Africa? What is the continent doing to forge its own defense?
That's the critical pivot. Our sources highlight two major internal defense mechanisms the continent's developing to insulate itself. First, on the political and security side, we have the African Union Peace and Security Council framework.
Right, the AU framework. And this isn't just a talking shop, is it? It's designed specifically to step in where the UN Security Council fails.
Exactly. The AU Peace and Security Council is Africa's institutional response to the realities of a paralyzed UN. It has actual mechanisms for crisis management.
Like what?
It can mandate interventions, deploy peacekeeping missions, and impose sanctions on member states that experience unconstitutional changes of government. It aims to serve as Africa's political shield.
To keep external conflicts out.
The goal is to create a unified diplomatic and security front so that external powers cannot easily exploit local fractures and turn African nations into proxy battlegrounds again. By strengthening this institutional framework, African nations are attempting to assert their own agency in a multipolar world.
So the AU framework acts as a political shield. But historically, regional political shields have cracked under severe economic pressure.
That's very true.
As we learned from the IMF and World Bank data earlier, the biggest, most immediate threat from the Middle East conflict isn't necessarily a military invasion. It's the economic shockwave of inflation and supply chain disruption.
Which is why the continent needs an economic shield too. And that brings us to the African Continental Free Trade Area, or the AFCFTA.
I love the analogy we were discussing earlier for this. Think of the AFCFTA not as a wall against the outside world, but as a regional power grid. If the global power grid goes down, say, because a geopolitical shock in the Middle East cuts off energy supplies or spikes transit costs, the AFCFTA is designed to be the localized microgrid that keeps the continent's factories running and its food supplies secure.
That macrogrid versus microgrid analogy is spot on. The AFCFTA is fundamentally a crucial intra-African resilience strategy. Let's look at the actual logistics and hurdles it's trying to solve based on our sources.
Let's do it.
Right now, because of legacy colonial infrastructure and extractive trade routes, it is often faster and cheaper for an African country to trade with Europe or Asia than with its immediate neighbor across the border.
Which is mind-boggling when you think about it.
It is, but that legacy infrastructure means African nations are hyper-exposed to global choke points. They rely on the Red Sea and the Strait of Hormuz to bring in basic goods.
So they're tethered to a vulnerable system.
Completely. What the AFCFTA aims to do is dismantle tariff barriers, harmonize customs regulations, and foster massive economic diversification to drastically increase intra-African trade.
So instead of importing refined fuel from the Middle East or fertilizer from Eastern Europe, they source it internally.
Exactly. If a nation can source its agricultural inputs, its manufactured goods, and eventually its energy from within the continent, the strategic leverage of external choke points decreases significantly.
Though building that out is no small feat.
Of course, the logistical hurdles are massive. Reversing decades of trade habits requires immense political will, upgrading cross-border infrastructure, and standardizing complex rules of origin.
But the payoff is worth it.
The strategic goal is clear. By building internal supply chains, Africa can insulate itself from the external shocks caused by Middle Eastern disruptions. It's about transitioning from a position of profound vulnerability to one of radical self-reliance.
It's a massive shift in perspective when you lay it all out like that. We started this deep dive looking at the highly vulnerable maritime choke points of the Middle East.
The cardiovascular system.
Right. We looked at how the EIA data shows millions of barrels of oil squeezing through incredibly narrow straits, and how the massive insurance premiums and rerouting delays act like a tax on the entire global south.
A tax nobody voted for.
Exactly. And we saw through the IMF and World Bank data how those disruptions send inflation shockwaves that hit African emerging markets exceptionally hard, threatening basic food security.
We also navigated the harsh realities of modern proxy warfare, mapped out by RAND, where states fight indirectly through funding and intelligence sharing to maintain plausible deniability.
And the fragile escalation control strategies from CSIS.
Right. And we contrasted the idealism of the UN Charter with the bare-knuckle survival logic of Mearsheimer's offensive realism, noting how the UN Security Council's veto power leaves it paralyzed in the face of great power competition.
But ultimately, that journey brought us right back to the African continent's response. We've seen exactly how global power rivalries, indirectly but forcefully, shape Africa's strategic future.
Pushing for real change.
It's pushing the continent to build the AU's political frameworks to prevent proxy exploitation and the AFTA's economic microgrid to buffer against supply chain shocks.
And this is where you, the listener, come in, because knowledge really is most valuable when it's actively applied to how you view the world.
Take this beyond the deep dive.
Exactly. As you read the news going forward, I want you to actively look for these deeper dynamics. When you read a headline about a skirmish in the Middle East, don't just see it as an isolated event.
Look for the proxy dynamics.
Yes. Ask yourself, who is funding the actors and why? Then trace that ripple effect. Look at the maritime insurance rates. Look at the commodities markets. Look at the inflation rates in emerging economies. You'll start to see the hidden wiring of the global system that we've been analyzing today.
Once you see that wiring, you really can't unsee it. And this exploration actually links back perfectly to some of our previous deep dives.
It does tie in nicely.
Remember when we explored global supply chain fragilities a few weeks ago? Today's deep dive is the ultimate real-world case study of that fragility. It shows exactly what happens when geopolitics crashes into global logistics.
And it perfectly sets the stage for where we're heading next.
Exactly. Our next logical theme in this series is going to look at how emerging markets globally are racing toward complete resource independence. We're going to see how the lessons learned from these choke point crises are driving a massive global restructuring of trade.
I'm really looking forward to digging into that one.
Same here.
But before we wrap up today, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over or explore on your own. We've seen today that the limits of global institutions are being starkly exposed by proxy wars. We know that maritime choke points will likely remain perpetually vulnerable to regional flare-ups.
It's the new normal.
So, given those realities, what is Africa's ultimate defense going to be over the next century? Is the continent going to have to rely on traditional hard military security, perhaps developing significant naval power to protect its own sea lanes and interests abroad? Or will radical economic self-reliance, achieved through the internal trade mechanisms of the ACFTA, be the only true sustainable armor in an increasingly multipolar world?
That is the defining question for the region's future. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.